Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this Easter weekend. I'm Kristen, and just before the band gets up to sing a couple of songs, here's a look at some of the things coming up here at Grace for you and your family.
Thank you guys very much for being here. Of course, you already know that it's Easter. This is the celebration of undoubtedly the most influential person in human history. And I don't say that because I'm a Christian. Even if you're an atheist, I think intellectually you'd have to be honest enough to agree that Jesus really is probably the most influential person in all of human history. I mean, time is divided around the dude's life. So whether or not you're a creationist or an evolutionist, you still measure when the earth began in relation to how many years it happened before Jesus showed up, right? And we measure when the Babylonians were here, the Persians and the ancient Medes and all of these different people groups, the Ming Dynasty. All of that stuff is measured when the Europeans discovered North America. I mean, the Napoleonic Wars. I mean, like everything in all of history is measured by how many years it happened before Jesus showed up or how many years it happened after Jesus showed up. So I'm going to say this. If all of time is measured by how far away it is from your life, then you'd be a pretty important person, right? So when it's all measured around that dude, like forget about the impact he made. Just the fact that all of time, like whether you call it common era, before common era, it doesn't matter. It's still all done around the life of Jesus. That's a big deal. The dividing line between where some of you might be and where I might be really does center around what we're celebrating today, which is the resurrection of Jesus. Because it's claimed that he died physically and physically rose from the dead. And that's the debate. Nobody debates on whether or not Jesus is a good guy. If you're an atheist, you would probably agree that Jesus was a good dude. Everybody concedes that point. Jesus is a good dude. But is he a good dude like Moses was a good dude? Is he a good dude like Muhammad was a good dude? Is he a good dude like Buddha was a good dude? Or is it a different kind of good dude? See, that different kind of good dude depends on whether or not the guy actually rose from the dead. If he didn't raise from the dead, then he's no different than Moses. He's no different from any of the other prophets. He's no different from Muhammad. He's no different from Buddha or Confucius. He's no different than anybody else. He's just one guy that started one religion among many. But if he rose from the dead, then he's unlike any other dude that a religion is based on. If Jesus physically rose from the dead, then he's God. Now see, I never questioned this as a kid raised in a church by a religious family. It wasn't until I was in my 20s that I met a friend who was an atheist. And he wasn't like a jerk atheist. You know, like there's jerk Christians? There's jerk Christians and there's jerk atheists, right? But then there's cool Christians and there's cool atheists. He was a cool atheist, so I was actually open to him. People are way more open to people who aren't jerks. That's what you learned at church today. Write that down, right? But he was a cool atheist, and so he had legitimate intellectual barriers to faith, and so he started asking questions he didn't have answers to, and that's what led to his atheism. And I was like, good point. Good point. Like, and I was like, oh my word, what if I don't believe anymore, right? Because I wasn't gonna just go along with this just because my mom and dad did. Like at some point, I had to decide, can I say with intellectual credibility that I believe this stuff too? And that's what we've been talking about the last few weeks here at Grace Church. 2 weeks ago, we talked about the historicity. By the way, one of the things I love about the Bible is that it's not a book about religious principles. It's a book that tells the stories of things that actually happened in human history. You can verify them or not. But either these things actually did happen or they did not. And that's not open to interpretation. Either Moses led people out of Egypt or he did not. That's not a matter of religion. That's a matter of history, right? Either there were 308 prophecies that were fulfilled but written at least 600 years before the time of Jesus that he fulfills, or there weren't. Either Jesus really did raise from the dead or he didn't. And all of the Hebrew scriptures say that someday God will show up, and all of the Greek scriptures, the Old Testament, New Testament, say that this is who he actually was when he did show up. And all of it is based on the resurrection. Paul concedes this point, the Apostle Paul, when he says, if there is no resurrection, then our faith is worthless. What are we doing? It's a joke. It's a waste of time. And what clinched it for me, and I don't have a lot of time because I've already talked about this. And by the way, if you're interested in more detail about this, you could go to our website, to the message 2 weeks ago. You could also go to about a year ago, we had a teaching called, Is the Bible Reliable? And you can go on that one also. We don't use the Bible to prove the Bible. We talked about it as a historical document, whether or not it's reliable. But what clinched it for me was the recognition that Christianity grew faster in the lifetime of eyewitnesses than at any other time in history. That's not a religious fact, that's a historical fact. That enough people against them that if they'd gotten the story wrong even a little bit, it wouldn't have even made it outside of Jerusalem. For instance, if I was going to start a new belief that Barack Obama was Mexican, how many of you guys are with me? Let's go. What would I have to do to get everybody to believe that Barack Obama was Mexican? I'd have to do two things. I'd have to destroy all the evidence that disproved it, and then I'd have to wait until everybody who had seen a picture, video, or him in person had died off the scene and couldn't discount it. Are you with me? But I definitely couldn't get that belief to catch on while eyewitnesses were still around. So if they're making up this whole thing about the resurrection, they'd have to at least go to another city where they'd never heard of Jesus. They wouldn't have started it in the city where all the eyewitnesses could have disproved it. In fact, that one piece of evidence was so convincing that that's all they used at the very beginning. Jesus was crucified, was buried, and rose from the dead, as you guys know. Drop the mic, peace, I'm off the stage. People are like, crap, I knew that. Right? I mean, that did it. It was even said by Nero only 18 years after the resurrection of Jesus that these followers of Christos have turned the world upside down with their teaching that their Messiah had risen from the dead. Nero knew the story of Jesus' resurrection. How is that possible if they were making it up? How about this? All the hundreds, the thousands of people who were followers of Jesus who were then tortured by Nero to recant that they had seen Jesus resurrected from the dead. Now, if you and I were going to make up a thing, like let's say we're going to make up that Barack Obama was Mexican, and like the government was like, no, we're going to kill you if you don't recant that. At what point would somebody begin to break? I gotta be honest, I'd be the first one. I'd say, hey, it's your idea. I'd point to somebody over here. It's your guys' idea right here. I was like, I didn't know you guys were gonna take it all so serious. But the fact that none of them did, what's the only logical explanation for that? What's the only rational explanation for that? As irrational as it sounds that Jesus rose from the dead, history shows me that the only rational explanation that he actually did. So we're not going to get into all of the other things like we did a few weeks ago. I want to get moving. Today we want to talk about 3 stories of hope from the resurrection story. People who were impacted by the resurrection of Jesus. My hope is that you're going to see yourself in one of these 3 stories. The first person that we're looking at is Peter. Peter's in John chapter 18. Now, Jesus had already had the Last Supper. You might remember the Last Supper because Da Vinci was there. He was painting them, and they were holding them really still. Just seeing who's awake. Anybody? All right. So, like, that's the Last Supper scene, and Jesus had said, all of you guys will abandon me. Zechariah had actually said that about 750 years earlier. Jesus reaffirms it on the night of the Last Supper, says, you guys are all going to abandon me. And Peter says, not me. Jesus says, uh-huh. He says, uh-uh. Jesus says, uh-uh. He says, uh-uh. He says, you're going to deny me 3 times the night before the rooster crows twice. He said, dude, if I died, I wouldn't deny you. Jesus goes, we'll see. Tells Judas, get it over with. Judas leaves. Runs to Caiaphas' house, the religious leaders, because Jesus was upsetting the status quo. He was leveling the playing field. He was saying that anybody has access to God. They said, no, you got to come through us, the priests. Right? They didn't like that. So he's enemy number 1. So they were coming after him. Jesus and the other 11 disciples go to the garden where Jesus is praying. Judas shows up. Jesus is arrested. All the other disciples fan out like cockroaches when you turn on a light. Just, poof, right? They go like crazy, running off into the woods. If there's a warrant out for Jesus' arrest, guess who else there's a warrant out for? The rest of them. And they don't want the same kind of trouble he's about to get into, so they take off. But not Peter. Peter, the fisherman, pulls out a sword. What in the world's he doing packing heat? You know somebody who gets like their CCW, or like their concealed carry weapons permit, and like they never shot a gun? You're like, seriously, you shouldn't have that. You're going to shoot you. You're on foot. What are you doing? Right? So they're like, Peter, he's like a fisherman. He probably had the sword on the wrong side. Hold up. He's supposed to have an officer. I don't know what it looked like. He pulls out that sword, though, right? And he goes, the Bible says he chops off Malchus' ear. Now hang on. Malchus is a servant of the high priest. Was he like chopping like this? And like he stopped at the shoulder, he just nicked the ear? Like, does that make any sense? What was he doing? He was going for the dude's head. Dude ducked. And it went, boom, got his ear off, right? And Peter's like, Viva la revolution! Right? And Jesus says, put away that sword. Those who live by the sword. That's a famous saying from Jesus, right? Jesus bends down, picks up the ear, puts it back on the head. Peter goes, I didn't know it was going to be like that. Drops the sword, and he runs too. But then he's like, oh, crud, I told Jesus I wouldn't deny him. So that's where we pick it up. John chapter 18, verse 15. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other of the disciples is John. In his account of the life of Jesus, there's 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus, and they give different details based on their perspectives, their personalities. And all the different details come together like this, kind of like if I was going to give a 1-paragraph description of somebody on the front row, and you were from the back. Our descriptions would be different. We're standing at separate angles, but they wouldn't contradict, they would complement. Well, that's what the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do. So we know that that other disciple is John, and he always referred to himself in the 3rd person. So he would say, Peter, James, and the other guy. We know the other guy is John, right? Peter, James, and the guy that Jesus loved. So he always referred to himself in the 3rd person that way. So that other disciple was acquainted with the high priest. We know from the other accounts that he's actually the cousin of the high priest. So like Jesus being arrested, but John ain't all that scared. You know why? Because his cousin's the chief of police. He's like, Teflon, this ain't going to stick. Do you know who I am? Go ahead, take my mug shot. I'm walking out of here in a minute, chump. I'm like, he's related to he's the cousin of the chief priest. He's the only one not in trouble. So watch this. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Verse 16, Peter had to stay outside the gate. So you ever had some friends who had backstage passes at a concert, and like you're like, oh, I didn't get one of those, but they're like, oh, just come with us, stick with us real quick. But then like the bouncer at the curtain, he's checking for lanyards, and like you put your jacket over like this so they can't see if you have a lanyard or not. But he checks, he's like, hold up, you can't go in. You're like, dang it, right? That's what's happening. Peter and John are following. John gets to go into the courtyard because he's cousins of the high priest. Peter's got to stay outside. Maybe you've been to a club with a bunch of friends. Like the girls got in, and the bouncer was like, hold up. No, or so they say. I don't know. I don't know about that. She's what I heard about the club. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. I think that's awesome. John just walks in and shows him his badge. High priest cousin, right? Peter's like, yeah, crap, got to stay outside. John comes back to that girl must have been a tough chick if she was the bouncer, right? So he comes back out to the gate and goes, he's with me. She's like, oh, my bad. You should have said so, right? So the woman asked Peter as he's walking by her, you're not one of that man's disciples, are you? No, I'm not. That was the first time he denied. But because it was cold outside, the household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. Now I'm going to point out that charcoal fire because this is the first of two times in the whole Bible where charcoal fire is mentioned. There wasn't something that Jews, that they did fire with wood, but this was something that was kind of like not really a part of their culture, kind of more of a Roman thing, but then they kind of had learned it, kind of a deal. The point is that a charcoal fire is never mentioned in the whole Bible until this moment. Now, John makes a big deal about pointing it out, and we're going to find out why John makes a big deal about pointing out what kind of fire it was. If you don't know what a charcoal fire is, if you're over 10 years old, you might have seen like an antique grill where they pour black rocks in there that light on fire. That's charcoal. That's the kind of fire this is. It's like heat without flame. It's magic. They stood around it warming themselves, and Peter stood with them warming himself. Bible tells us that then Jesus was taken into, the courtyard was about as big as this stage, and then Caiaphas, the high priest, his house was connected to it, and the basement of his house was used for like interrogation. They had a limestone, I've seen it, limestone beam with holes through it that leather straps are put. And so they would take a prisoner down there, they would tie his wrist to those leather straps and that beam above his head so that his midsection was exposed. So if they wanted to work him in the body, then he could maybe raise his knees a little bit to protect himself, but at some point his stomach muscles would become fatigued, and then he'd just be wide open. And then of course his face and his head, so if they wanted to work him in the head a little bit, then he was completely exposed that way too. And but there's a window where everybody who's in the courtyard could see into the basement, and everybody in the basement, if they were by the window, could look out. So they could hear the conversations that were happening. So Peter and everybody else in the courtyard is hearing the way that this discussion, this interrogation is beginning to ramp up a little bit. It's getting really tense and very uncomfortable. In verse 25, meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, you're not one of his disciples, are you? In fact, one of the other accounts says that at that second time, somebody was like, but you got the same accent he does. You got a Galilean accent. Jesus has that same accent. You guys both sound the same. Are you sure you're not one of his disciples? And he denied it, saying, no, I'm not. And that was the second time he denied Jesus. Verse 26, but one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus? I was there. Now, I was like, if somebody is in like a throwdown at a barbecue and somebody chops somebody else's ear off and the dude without the ear is your cousin, you're going to remember the face of the dude who chopped his ear off. Yes or no? That's her. I was there. That was you. That's my cousin. Like, I saw that, dude. And we'll know from one of the other accounts that's where Peter starts swearing, because she's got more evidence. So he's thinking to himself, if I start swearing, maybe I'll throw him off the scent a little bit. So he's like, blankety blank blank, no, I am not. Then the rooster crows. The Bible also says that that Jesus in the basement, who was just on the other side of this stage, when the rooster crowed the second time after Peter denied Jesus the third time, the Bible says that Peter looked out the window and made eye contact with Peter. How awkward would that have been? Jesus looks out the window. Peter denies Jesus, hears the rooster, and instantly looks over at the window, and Jesus is already looking at him. Matthew and Mark tell us that he completely falls apart. The Bible says he weeps bitterly. you ever wept bitterly? Did you ever do something so shameful that when you were caught, you just wished you could just die? You don't want to live anymore. It's like it's that bad. Like you did something so rotten, you hate you more than anybody else hates you. That's where Peter's at. And he runs off into the night and goes into hiding too. So the guys in the basement work Jesus over, the Bible says, until the early hours of the morning, Friday morning. They get to a place where Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Now that doesn't sound like a big deal, because aren't we all the sons of God kind of a deal? But a Jew would have never said they're the sons of God. They would say they're the sons of Abraham. They would never have said the sons of God, because in their culture, the son had as much authority as the dad did. So it was a paternalistic culture, right? So if my son was around and I wasn't around, and you asked my son, Garrett, would you sign this paper, this agreement or whatever, I was now legally bound because my son signed it. So there was legally, there was no difference between me and my son. We were essentially the same. So no Jew would have ever said, I am the Son of God, because then they're claiming to be equal to God. That was a big deal. So when Jesus said that he was the Son of God, the high priest rips his clothes and says, blasphemy, do we need any more witnesses? He deserves to die. They wouldn't have said that if Jesus was claiming to be on God's team. They were all claiming to be on God's team. But he said, I am divine, I'm God. They said he deserves death, but they don't have authority to kill people because they're under Roman authority. So he dragged him over to Pilate's house. Pilate's woken up 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He's like, what? What's this about? It's about a Jew. He broke a Jewish law? Go back to, no, it's your problem. Deal with it. They said, well, he said he's king of the Jews, but we have no king but Caesar. Are you on Caesar's team or not? Oh, shoot. Right? Now it just got real. Because they're threatening, like, if this gets back to Caesar, that this guy claimed to be king of the Jews and he didn't deal with it, he gets his head chopped off, right? So now he's got to do something about it. So they take him into the basement, and they've got this whip called a flagrum, and it's got like lead balls at the end of these different braided leather straps that have bone worked into the different braids. And the lead balls at the end of these straps would break the bones when they would hit, and it gave the whip some heft. So boom, and it would stick to you because of all the bones. They were sharp bones, and so they would stick into the skin, and then they would just rip it right off of you like this. And so what we know from history is that many times the slaves or the prisoners did not survive the beating because they would be disemboweled. They would have so much blood loss that they would go into hypovolemic shock. The heart would be beating so fast, but there'd be no blood to be pumping. Then they would pass out, and they would die. The Bible says that Jesus was beaten so badly that you couldn't tell he was a man. I don't believe it means that you couldn't tell that he wasn't a human species. I believe you couldn't tell what gender, like he was that mangled. And then they made him carry a 150-pound crossbeam across the city to the place where then they were going to nail him to it. Okay, you know the statues of like the skinny, wimpy Jesus on the cross? That skinny one, right? Ain't no skinny dude going to survive that kind of a beating in the first place. And then 2, survive that kind of a beating and pick up 150 pounds of dead weight on his shoulder and carry it through the city. You know what I'm saying? So you can worship the skinny Jesus or the 8-pound baby Jesus with Ricky Bobby, I don't care. My Jesus is a beast. He was a carpenter before they had power tools. When that dude wanted lumber, he didn't go to Home Depot, he went to the woods. Chopped down a tree and made himself a 2x4. That dude's forearms were like your thighs. Seriously. How else do you explain him surviving the beating and then picking up 150 pounds of dead weight, putting it on his shoulders and beasting it like a champ across the city? Oh, he fell down halfway? The fact he ain't dead yet. Dude's a freaking champ. Right? He dies. Bible says that they took a spear to make sure that he was dead and jammed it up under his ribs, all the way up into his. And by the way, when you go into hypovolemic shock, fluid begins to collect around your lungs and your heart. There's evidence for this. Jesus had hypovolemic shock because he was also thirsty. Your body's trying to replace the fluids. You pass out, which Jesus most likely did when he was carrying the crossbeam. Came to when he's on the cross. But they stick the spear up in his side. And the Bible says that when they pierced him, like you seen that like little cut in all the statues? Dude, this spear went up and it pierced the fluid sac around his lungs and his heart. Because the Bible says that blood and water flowed. Where'd that water come from? That was the fluid that collects around your heart and your lungs when you go into hypovolemic shock. That dude had a spear jammed in him from here all the way up into his chest cavity, through his lungs, and into his chest, into his heart. That dude was dead, but not a bone broken. You know why? Because 1,200 years earlier, David said in Psalm chapter 34, verse 20, that Messiah would not have a single bone broken when he died. The other two dudes on these side, their kneecaps were broken. Because crucifixion was death by asphyxiation. You couldn't breathe, and so they would break your legs so that you couldn't push up on your legs anymore to catch another breath, and you would just choke to death. But they came to Jesus. That dude's dead. Make sure. Ram that spear way up in his body and pull it out. Well, that's getting really close to Passover. None of the ladies that were there, the Bible says the only people that were at the only people from Jesus' team at the crucifixion were the women and John. You know what I've always wondered my entire life? Where in the world's the rest of the disciples? Why won't anybody else man up? Where were the rest of the disciples? They bounced, that's right. They were running. They were in hiding. Why? Because if they show up where Jesus is being crucified, where all the soldiers are, guess what's going to happen to them? The same thing is happening to Jesus. Why was John there? He's got the hookup with the chief of police. He's the only dude who could show up and not be arrested. So it's all the women and John. But they got to go back and take care of the Passover Seder because it's almost dark. Ain't nobody take care of the body of Jesus. So the body's taken down. Everybody goes home. John goes with them. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, the guy who came to Jesus earlier by night, go to Pilate privately and ask to take his body. And they got 100 pounds of aloe, which was imported in those days from India. Those dudes dropped some serious coin on this perfume to anoint his body. But they did it secretly. Nobody knew that they did this. So he was dead for part of the day on Friday. He was dead all day on Saturday, dead part of the day on Sunday. So he's dead he crossed over 3 days in his death like the Bible said. But Psalm chapter 16 verse 10 said the Holy One of Israel would not be dead long enough to stink. So we know that he can't be dead long enough that his decomposition would begin to produce an odor. So it had to be, he was dead, really dead, but not dead too long, according to Psalms. But that explains why Mary and the other ladies show up at the tomb on Sunday with spices to anoint the body of Jesus, because they don't think anybody's taken proper care of his dead body, because those two guys did it in secret. So I always wondered, why did they come to do that again? It was already done, but they didn't know it had already been done. That's where we pick up the story in John chapter 20. John chapter 20, early on Sunday morning while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She didn't look at it. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. Who's that? John. And she said, they've taken the Lord's body out of the tomb and we don't know where they put him. Isn't that crazy? If they're making up the story, would they put in there that the first person who saw the tomb did not believe Jesus had resurrected from the dead? 6 months ago, he said what would happen. 6 months ago, he said, I'll be betrayed by our leaders to the Gentiles who will kill me. I will be dead for 3 days, and then I'll come back again to life on the third day after that. Mary shows up on the third day. It was Friday, Saturday, now it's Sunday. She shows up on Sunday. The tomb is rolled away, and her first thought isn't, Jesus came back to life. You know what her first thought is? Somebody stole the body. Now, is that a discrediting detail or a crediting detail? It discredits. That his own followers didn't believe it. Why would they put that in there if they were making this up about Jesus resurrected from the dead? The only rational explanation why they would put that discrediting detail in the story is because they were telling the truth. It's the only thing that makes sense. The other thing is this. A woman's testimony was not accessible in court in those days. Sorry, it's not my rules, it was theirs. But she couldn't testify in court. She's just a woman. So if they were making it up, why would they say that the first witness, the first eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus was a woman whose testimony was not reliable? I mean, if they're making it up, why set themselves up for failure? The only explanation why they would put a woman as the first eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus is what? That's the only rational explanation. So as irrational as it may seem, it's the only rational conclusion that we can make to the story. It's the only thing that makes sense. So here's what happens. Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb, and they were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. Humble brag, right? He said, hey, listen, both of them started running, and the other dude beat him. Don't like to brag, but I got wheels. I got new Easter shoes. And everybody knows that Easter shoes make you run fast, like all new shoes do, right? So he says, I beat him. Don't want to brag. But he stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings laying there, but didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside, and he also noticed the linen wrappings. And for the sake of time, we're not going to read the rest, but what happens is John looks in too and sees that the tomb is empty, and he believes. And the angels tell them to go back to the disciples and tell them what they've seen. But Mary doesn't go. Here's verse 11. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she stooped and looked in, and she saw two white-robed angels, one sitting in the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. Dear woman, why are you crying? The angels asked her. Because they've taken away my Lord, she replied, and I don't know where they've put him. So while John and Peter believed that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, Mary still didn't buy it. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. She turned to leave, verse 14, and saw someone standing there, and it was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. Remember, verse 1 said that it was really early in the morning. It was still dark outside, so she didn't recognize Jesus. He said, dear woman, why are you crying? Jesus asked, and who are you looking for? She thought he was the gardener, and she said, sir, if you took him away, just tell me where you put him, and I'll go get him. And then he goes, Mary. When he says her name, she turned to him and cried out, Rabboni. You probably had a moment like that, right? Like somebody called you, said your name, and you automatically knew who it was. You didn't have to ask. It's not like my wife. My wife calls. She says, hey, babe. Okay, I know who that is. Hello, babe. Who could this be? So many people call me babe. Right? So my mom will call, and she'll go, Sean? And it always goes, Sean. Like it always ends up. Like my mom's, when she's, Sean? It's Sean. Like it always, and it annoys the crap. No, I'm just kidding. But I know my mom's name, right? Or I know my mom's voice when she says my name. That's what happened. She's broken. Her world is devastated. And Jesus, the hope of Israel, God in the flesh. I thought he was God, but he died? How can God die? It doesn't even make any sense. He's dead. What could be worse? Then she shows up, and it is worse. You know what would be worse than losing somebody that you love too young in life is going to their cemetery for the very first time and finding somebody having desecrated their grave. That's how you make it worse. She shows up already broken only to find that somebody has desecrated the body. What have they done with it? Thrown it in the river, dismembered it, mailed it to different places around the Roman Empire. All she knows is that they've desecrated the body of Jesus. So what? She didn't think it would get any worse, but it did. She's happy now, and Jesus says, go back to the disciples and tell them what happened. She goes back to the disciples. I saw the Lord, and they don't believe her. You know why? She's a woman. In those days, her testimony didn't count. So again, if they were making it up, why would they make a girl be the first one to see Jesus? That doesn't make any sense. If they were making it up, they would have made it a dude. So the fact that it doesn't make the only rational explanation is that they were telling the truth. That's why I believe it's historically reliable. Because of all these little details like this. They locked themselves in a room waiting for Jesus. But the Bible says they locked themselves up because they're afraid of the Jewish leaders because they're all afraid of being arrested. But Thomas isn't there. Where's Thomas at? We don't know. The Bible doesn't say. Obviously, he's better at hide and seek than the other disciples. So here's what happens later on. Verse 24, one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, was not with the others when Jesus came, and they told him, we saw the Lord. But he replied, I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds in his hands. Nope, goes further. I won't believe it till I put my fingers into those nail holes and place my hand into the cut on his side. Okay, that's gross. You know what I would say? I won't believe it unless I see it. That would have been enough. That's the way he started off. But he just like ramps it up like super high for no good reason. Why? What's the point? You know what? I won't believe it unless I see it. You know, even if I saw it, I don't think I'd believe it. I'd have to put my fingers through the nail holes and my hand in his guts. You know what he's saying? I don't believe it no matter what. No matter what you say, no matter what I see, no matter what, I will not believe that. That dude has some serious doubts, right? 8 days later, verse 26, the disciples were together again, and this time Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, but suddenly as before, Jesus was standing among them. He said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. Come here. Oh, you heard that? Come on, chump, man up. Here you go. That had to be weird. I don't know if he actually did it, but that would be gross. Especially if it made, oh, now it's about to get real gross. Sounds and, now I'm thinking, oh, I just made somebody sick. I'm sorry. We're going to stop it right there. But he says, put your finger here and look at my hands. Put your hand in the wound on my side. Don't be faithless any longer, believe. Thomas says, my Lord and my God. Boom! What? That's what it took for him to believe. Now, Jesus told him to go to Galilee and wait on him, so they go to Galilee and they're waiting. But Peter still hadn't had that awkward conversation. You ever done something so bad to somebody, you're like, dear God, please let me never see them again. Then you were in the mall, you saw them on the other side of the mall, on the other side of the food court, and you're like, crap, we got to go. And your new girlfriend is like, why? Why we got to hurry? Trust me. Leave. Right? There's some people you just dread seeing, but you know when you do see them, you're going to have that conversation. But dear God, not today. That's where Peter's at. Like, he doesn't want to talk about this. It's embarrassing. It's his most shameful moment. The only people who know about it are John and Jesus. Hopefully he didn't tell any of the other disciples. The most shameful thing he'd ever done. So Peter doesn't want to wait anymore. They're waiting in Galilee. He goes, I'm going to go fishing. I don't want to be here when Jesus shows up. So the other disciples are like, all right, we'll go with you. So they all go fishing. Jesus is standing on the beach about 100 yards from shore. Peter and the disciples haven't caught anything all night long. Jesus shows up. The Bible says they don't recognize him from that distance. The Sea of Galilee is really hazy, an awful lot of the times. So Jesus goes, hey, fellas, you guys catch anything? No, we didn't catch anything. Throw your nets on the right side of the boat. They do, and they took a ton of fish. And John says, I think that's Jesus, Peter. Peter's like, oh, my word, I think you're right. Peter jumps into the water, swims to shore, gets there before anybody else does. When he walks up to Jesus, Jesus has a fire going, and the fire's made of charcoal. Oh, shoot. It's on. What? Jesus never lit a charcoal fire before. What's Jesus trying to do? Set the stage. He's telling Peter, dude, we need to talk. Peter walks up, he sees that charcoal fire. Last time he saw a charcoal fire, only 2 places in the whole Bible charcoal fire is mentioned, is the first time Peter denied Jesus and when Jesus forgave him for it. Only 2 places in the whole Bible, right? Jesus releases him of the tension. He says, that's okay, Peter, go get a fish and we'll talk after breakfast. So he goes back to the water, helps the guys bring in the fish, grabs the fish, Jesus cooks some breakfast, they hang out. Verse 15 of chapter 21, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Verse 16, Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. Third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter's feelings were hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. Then Jesus said, then feed my sheep. How many times did Peter deny Jesus? How many times did Jesus give him a second chance? If Peter denied Jesus 4 times, how many times did Jesus have asked that question? If Peter had denied Jesus 6 times, how many times did Jesus have asked that question? See, there's a conversation that Peter and Jesus had in Matthew chapter 8, where Peter, trying to impress Jesus with how much he was learning from Jesus, says, hey, listen, we were just talking about forgiveness. And I told them that if somebody sinned against me 7 times the same way in the same day, I'd forgive them all 7. That's pretty good, right, Jesus? And Jesus says, no, Peter. If somebody sins against you 70 times, 7 times, you should forgive them. That's 490. Now, the point that Jesus was making is not that at 491 in one day, you could not forgive them anymore. I mean, could somebody even hurt you 490 times in one day? What would that look like? Poke you in the eye? Sorry. At some point, dude, block the dude, right? 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 I don't think it's even possible for somebody to offend you 490 times in one day. The point you're trying to make is if they offend you 1,000,000 times, if they feel remorse and ask for forgiveness, you forgive them. Now, I don't know where you find yourself in the story. Maybe you're like Mary. And honestly, in this past year, you've lost a loved one. And you don't feel like God's anywhere near you because there's so much pain. Just like the pain blinded Mary, the pain's blinding you. And maybe you didn't lose a loved one, but maybe you lost a job. Maybe you got cancer, so you lost your health. Maybe you found out that your husband cheated on you. Or somebody that you thought loved you, dumped you. And the pain is so bad that you just felt like it can't get any worse. And then it does get worse. And you're sitting there saying, God, if you're really there, why don't you freaking care about me? And you can't see him anywhere. You don't feel God. You don't feel loved by God for sure. And now you're beginning to question whether or not he's even real because the pain is so intense. And the hope that you find in the Easter story is that whether or not you see God or feel God, he's there. And he knows your name. And that even when life is bad, God is good. And when Satan brings things into your life to ruin you, God can twist those things around to use them for good, but not if you blame him for them. Not if you use that as an excuse to run away. But when the bad things happen in our life and we use that to push us to God, that's when we find hope. Or maybe you're like Thomas. All of everybody else obviously believes in the resurrection of Jesus. All the other disciples do. I guess I'm the only one. And so you're sitting in a room full of people that you think everybody believes in the resurrection of Jesus. But I get news for you. There's a lot of people at Grace Church that aren't Christians. You're coming for whatever reasons. I'm glad you're here. And you've got legitimate questions and doubts. We think this is where you ought to be bringing them. We're glad you're here. And if you have legitimate reasons for not believing in God, you're like Thomas, who didn't believe. It should come as an encouragement to you that Jesus didn't hate on him for it. He didn't say, what, you've been hanging out with me for 3.5 years and you still don't believe? What do I got to do, punk? He didn't do any of that. You know why? Because Jesus isn't threatened in his identity by your doubts. God's not up in heaven going, oh no, what am I going to do? Joe don't believe in me. Angels get him. If there is a God, he knows who he is and he's pretty secure in his identity. He don't need you to believe in him. Now, if you're open to the idea that you might be wrong, then my encouragement to you is to follow the example of Thomas. I'm asking you to make this prayer. Dear God, if you are there, prove it to me before Christmas. Didn't Thomas say prove it? Did God hate him for that? Yes or no? He allowed him to ask that. Why can't you? Now, I don't think you're allowed to tell him on what conditions. The deal is you just want to be able to know in your heart that he's real, right? So that's whatever it takes, God, for that. I'm open to the possibility that I might. Here's the deal. What have you got to lose? If he's not there, then what? Nothing. Nobody knows you prayed that anyway. So you get to keep your atheist credibility. Your membership card. Right? But if there is a God, wouldn't you want to know that you were wrong? Or maybe you're like Peter. You used to be religious. You know who Jesus is. You know he died on the cross. You know that he rose from the dead. But there's been a whole lot that's happened between then and now. You graduated from high school and your faith in the same year. You met somebody in college. You kind of walked away from it all. They had questions. You didn't have answers. Life happened. Poop hit the fan. It all landed on you. I don't think there is a God. There is a God. He definitely doesn't love me. You bailed. But you're at a place now where you know he's there. You're like Peter. And you almost feel like you need to be punished. So you won't let yourself come back to God, either out of self-pity or self-loathing. I don't know. But let me ask you this. Have you done anything so bad as to watch Jesus be crucified and deny him to his face while it was happening? You done anything that bad? No? Then if Peter could do that not once, but 3 times and be forgiven, then what have you ever done that God can't forgive? The hope for Easter for you is that if you've sinned against God 1,000 times, how many second chances will he give you? If you sinned against God 1,000,000 times, how many times will he forgive you? The truth is, if you feel distant from God, it's not because of God. He's just waiting for you to get to the end of your pity party. Get over yourself. Let go of your pride. Humble yourself. First time Peter ever preached this, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, they said, what should we do next? He told them, turn from your sin, follow Jesus. You know what you need to do? Turn from your sin and follow Jesus. Or not. Just between you and God, but I'm going to give you a chance to make it right if you would bow your head with me. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for these 3 stories in the Easter message. Thank you, God, that we can find ourselves in it. if you would identify most with Mary and that you just can't see God anywhere in your life, can you say by faith, God, I trust you even though I don't understand you? God, you're good even though my life is not. God, heal my broken heart. Put the pieces back together again, dear God, please. Fix me on the inside. Heal me. If you're like Thomas, maybe you could just sit there and say, God, all right, I'll give you till Christmas. I'm open to the idea that you might be there. And if you are, just let me know it. Or maybe you're like Peter. You know Jesus died for your sin and rose from the dead. You just think there's too much sin for it to count for you. So the hope from Easter for you is that you can have forgiveness too if you humble yourself and ask for it. So do that. Jesus, thank you for taking the punishment for my sins so I wouldn't have to. Thank you for raising from the dead with new life to give me a new life. That's what I want. It's what I need. Forgive me. Save me from all of it and help me to follow you with the rest of my life. God, I pray that you are pleased by the attitude and direction of our hearts. And for those, God, who aren't there yet, I'm asking you, please, in the name of Jesus, for your glory and for their good, give them another chance. At some other day and some other time. We ask this in your great name. Amen.